it's really important to try as much as you can to create an even playing field. Gaza is called the world's largest open-air prison, and Israel is accused in this first principle of committing war crimes against humanity. 2, the statement is recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. In this and the following demand, only Arab Palestinians are referred to as indigenous dwellers. Jews living in Palestine from ancient to modern times are non-existent. Israel is accused of subjugating Palestinians who comprise, quote, 1/5 of Israeli citizens, to a system of racial discrimination, forcibly displacing Palestinian communities in Israel from their land, and routinely and openly inciting racial violence against them, end quote. And then the third principle, quote, is respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. This continues a quote from the third principle. Since its violent establishment in 1948, through the ethnic cleansing of more than half of the indigenous people of Palestine, Israel has set out to control as much land and uproot as many Palestinians as it can. As a result of this systematic displacement, there are now more than 7.25 million Palestinian refugees. They are denied the right to return to their homes simply because they are not Jewish, end quote. And I'm sure that many of you sitting here already spot the historical inaccuracies as well as the insightful language, I would call it. This has been examined recently in the New York Times by Nathan Thrall, who discussed the condemnation which is inherent in critiques. Thrall says the BDS movement casts the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a struggle against apartheid as defined by the International Criminal Court, end quote. In addition, struggles on behalf of persons of color, such as Black Lives Matter and a variety of groups promoting justice for women, both causes of which many Jews support, are widely viewed as being intersectional with the plight of the Palestinians. In a response to Thrall, Israeli Brigadier General Yosef Kuperwasser, who I know spoke to this group, argues that the BDS movement's overt purpose is to bring down the state of Israel. I would like to also talk to you about, in regard to this, the statements of Judah Pearl, who's the father of Daniel Pearl. You might remember that he was a Wall Street Journal reporter who was captured, and he was asked if he was Jewish, and he declared, "I am Jewish," and his head was removed piecemeal with a knife. So this is Judah Pearl, and he wrote an article for the Los Angeles Review of Books called BDS and Zionophobic Racism. I think this is a really clever nomenclature, because Zion, Z-I-O-N, Zionophobic, sounds like xenophobic, hatred of the other. So what he's doing is he's putting the hatred of Israel into the category of xenophobia, which is not good. Liberals don't like, I'm a liberal, but sometimes liberals lose sight that Israel is part of their world, and by putting Zionophobic into the xenophobic clause, it's really important because very often the statement is made that people who are pro-Israel are de facto racists, and that since all Jews are white, that it is impossible for Israel to suffer from racial hatred, from racist hatred. And by calling this Zionophobic, he's just in one word calling our attention to the fact that part of what Israel is suffering from is racism against Israel. Judea Pearl writes that the true aim of BDS is, quote, to bombard campuses with an endless stream of invective against Israel. BDS writes piercingly of some real, and remember the last session I stressed that there are terrible things which are happening on both sides, but the reasons for their happening are different, of some real and some invented outrages. And as much as some of these outrages against Palestinian populations are real, as well as those that are invented, what's notable about the BDS language is that there's no awareness, on purpose, no awareness of the suffering of Jews and the very real dangers that support the Jewish citizens of Israel. Here are some of Judea Pearl's comments on Israel's settlements and security wall, which receives so much hateful description. Pearl says, how can an honest person fixate on the wall and not notice the deeply entrenched triple-tier 100-foot wall of Arab rejectionism that blocks all roads to peace? Assigning guilt to one side only, again, this is Pearl continuing, is dishonest, reckless, racist. Israel derives no pleasure from controlling another people's lives. The current situation is imposed on Israel by neighbors who continue to announce that they wish her dead. BDS's complaints about travel restrictions on students in the West Bank appear grotesque in comparison, end quote. And Pearl points out, as I mentioned earlier, that Omar Barghouti, the co-founder and top ideologist of BDS, stated in 2014, Jews in Israel are not a people. Jews in Israel are not a people. The UN principle of the right of self-determination does not apply to the Jews of Israel. This is what Omar Barghouti said. So whenever we're talking and trying to be even-handed about suffering on both sides of the issue, we need to always, always bring into the discussion the extent to which Jewish history, Jewish suffering, Jewish connections to the land of Israel are completely denied, either ignored or denied, in many of these social movements, in the language of the social movements themselves. BDS calls Israel a white settlers colonialist society, ignoring first the historical Jewish link to Israel, and second, distinctive Jewish peoplehood. If Jews are white in America, those Jews who happen to be white because about a fifth of them are persons of color, but to the extent that persons with paler skin who are Jewish happen to be white in America, that's pretty recent. I'm old enough to remember, and a few other people here are, that in our childhood, Jews certainly were not regarded as white. But we always need to remember that even that statement, which is referred to as a simple factual statement, is just non-factual. And then finally, Pearl delineates Zionophobia, the antipathy to Jewish self-determination, is no less heinous than Islamophobia, the antipathy to Islam and Muslims. So those are some of the things that I wanted to bring to the table about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I felt like it was worth spending a little time on because it's the most commonly known movement. And it has been brought up, voting for it has been brought up at many, many American universities. It actually has not been adopted by many. But we need to understand that the language of the BDS movement is extreme, and it negates many things about Jews and Jewish history, as well as about Israel. Okay, the second second movement I want to talk about is intersectionality. This one has a lot of personal meaning for me because, as I mentioned, I'm an old feminist. And anti-Israel rhetoric has actually been common, especially in the international feminist community, ever since the beginning. So that's nothing new, unfortunately. But it has become much more egregious since the idea of intersectionality has been adopted by many enemies of Israel. Now, the idea of intersectionality, I think, is a really, really important idea. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 talked about the fact that people may have something in common with people who they've never met, who don't live near them, because their lives, interests, and problems are similar. So another way of saying that they're similar is to say that they intersect. One of the things I think is ironic is that the reason the Jews in the United States were so active in the civil rights movement, really, for many Jews, that was an expression of their Jewishness. My job, when I'm not here, is actually to study American Jews and Jewish identity, and I can tell you that there are so many liberal American Jews who I've interviewed who, when you ask them, what does being Jewish mean to you, they talk about working for civil rights. This was their expression of prophetic Judaism, to bring freedom to all the people. And it's real to them, it's internal to them, and it's their understanding of Judaism. So for Jews like that to then be told that because the faces of Jews who were in certain European settings are paler than other faces, that their lives cannot intersect with persons of color in the United States for whom they have worked for decades, this is a big shock. So that's one big shock. And then the second big shock has to do with feminism. For Jewish women who are pro-Israel to be told in many of the women's movements, well, you're not a real feminist, because if you were a real feminist, you would condemn Israel. So there's an orthodoxy there, a rigidity, an unwillingness to see how complex these issues are, which makes Jews once again a kind of a pariah group, pushed out of and delegitimated in movements that many of them were instrumental in forming and working for. I'm going to read to you from an op-ed piece in the Times by a woman named Emily Shire called "Does Feminism Have Room for Zionists?" On March 8th, women around the world will be abstaining from work and rallying in the streets as part of, this was 2017, as part of the International Women's Strike, with the aim of starting an international feminist movement that challenges the sexual, physical, and economic exploitation of women. Emily Shire says, as a proud and outspoken feminist who champions reproductive rights, equal pay, increased female representation in all levels of government, and policies to combat violence against women, I would like to feel there's a place for me in this strike. However, as someone who is also a Zionist, I am not certain there is. Although I hope for a two-state solution, and although I am critical of the Israeli government policies, I identify as a Zionist because I support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Increasingly, I worry that my support for Israel will bar me from the feminist movement that, in aiming to be inclusive, has come to insist that feminism is connected to a wide variety of political causes. Emily Shire continues, I am troubled by the portion of the International Women's Strike platform that calls for, quote, decolonization of Palestine, end quote, as part of the beating heart of the new feminist movement. She says, I am happy to debate Middle East policies or listen to critiques of Israeli policies. But why should criticism of Israel be key to feminism in 2017? And then she talks about the fact that some of the people who helped plan this march were in fact convicted of deaths of Israelis in terrorist activities. The organizers of the International Women's Strike are not the first feminist group to position opposition to Israel as part of the feminist movement. She reminds us that Columbia University's anti-sexual advocacy group, anti-sexual assault advocacy group, No Red Tape, said that sexual assault survivors are just like Palestinians. And then she talks about the National Women's Studies Association, which voted to endorse, one of the few organizations that did vote to endorse BDS.
In the Labour Party, if you don't subscribe to these key worldviews, if you're not pro-Palestinian, for free education, and against Trident, our nuclear deterrent system, then you are the enemy. Anything can be allowed. You can be racist, you can be homophobic, transphobic, sexist. As long as you subscribe to the right worldview, you're fine. And we see that really clearly in cases like Chris Williamson and Pete Wilsman, both of whom have said that. Pete Wilsman, a lot of people also believe he's a misogynist as well as an anti-Semite. He's allowed straight through because he has that long, loyal history of being a comrade on the left. It's a refusal for self-definition. You know, if I went up and told someone that I'd received misogyny, people would say, oh my God, that's terrible, let's try and stop that. If I went up in the Labour Party and told them that I'd received anti-Semitism, it'd probably be a quite patronising, but did you really, love?
Exactly.
It's the lack of... There was a case in the UK a long time ago. In the late 90s, a young black man called Stephen Lawrence was murdered. And there was an inquiry called the Macpherson Inquiry, and the Macpherson Principle came out of it. And it states that a victim or third party can self-define the racism and abuse that they receive. It's investigated as such in the Crown Prosecution Service, the criminal courts. But the original investigation comes from the context of it being a hate crime. The Jewish Labour movement, as David said, affiliated with the Labour Party in 1920, having been founded in 1903 as Polet Zion, or the Workers of Zion. I became their director. And, you know, I was so proud. I was so proud when I got that job because I felt like it was the perfect intersection of my political, my personal, my Jewish identities. We started as, well, we still are good faith actors, people who genuinely wanted to help the Labour Party solve its problem with anti-Semitism. Person after person and people after people have had the same conversations, and nothing's changed. And I don't know how acquainted you are with some of the examples, but I always use the example of Naz Shah and Ken Livingstone. Naz Shah is a Labour MP who posted some really horrendously offensive things on the internet, really horrendous. She turned around, resigned the whip, suspended herself from party disciplinary procedures, and said, I've done something wrong, I should apologise, go on a journey and learn from that. Ken Livingstone, who willfully distorted the Holocaust, insists he's right, to this day, despite the fact that experts from around the world, Jewish and non-Jewish, have told him he's wrong. And it's that idea of willful versus unwillful anti-Semitism. The culture of the Labour Party is such that anti-Semitism is seeped within it. And plenty of people will turn around and say awful things. And if someone calls them out and says, you know, that's wrong, if they turn around and say, mate, I'm so sorry, that's fine. Because you learn and you educate yourself as time goes on. But the culture has become such that although every single anti-Semitic trope has come out, people don't really believe it. And they say, oh, well, someone else told me it was fine. There's no understanding of listening to the Jews or listening to the chief rabbi or experts like the Davids and people who really understand what's going on. And there's been a huge personal cost to these Jewish activists who've stood up. One Jewish Labour MP had to move house because of anti-Semitism. Huge amounts of us have gone through horrendous issues with our mental health because we've spoken out and the abuse we've got. And it's not been easy, but it's important to stand up and talk about it. I'm going to talk through a few key examples of things we've tried to do and the impact it's had, hoping that it'll explain some of these in context. And David didn't talk about it much. This is called the Mir 1 mural. It was put up in the early 2010s. I think it was 2011 in East London. And as happened on the Panorama programme actually, the author describes it as the Zionists breaking, not the Zionists, the Rothschilds, apologies, the Rothschilds breaking the backs of the poor. So you see the Rothschilds pictured here with neo-Nazi hook noses as Jewish. You see various other symbols playing this game of capitalist monopoly, breaking the backs of the poor. The council, which actually incidentally was run by some people who were really heavily accused of anti-Semitism, and they realised it was really bad, which should have been a quite key signal that it was really bad. And they agreed to take it down. And Jeremy Corbyn posted on his Facebook page that it should stay up, that it's a really good work of art. This is found out, and Luciana Berger actually tweets about it on Friday afternoon. 20 minutes later, ironically, I walk into a meeting with the leaders of the opposition's office. Just a pre-scheduled meeting to introduce them to one of my new colleagues. And this is a stakeholder manager of the leader's office, someone who we had a very good relationship with, who we worked with. Not that anything really changed with the work we did. And we sat down and we said, have you seen this? And they said, yeah. That looks bad, doesn't it? And we were like, yeah, it does look bad. And they said, can you explain it? So we did. I'd actually never seen this mural before. It had happened whilst I was at university. And it kind of passed me by because, you know, freshmen, universities don't really notice much. They took 4 different statements coming out under Jeremy Corbyn's office's name to get it right. And not once did they say sorry. 2 days later, it's about 1% of the British Jewish community demonstrated in Parliament Square, outside Parliament. The idea of 1% of any community that's based across the whole country demonstrating is crazy. A huge amount of people, you know, people from outside London came down, people who'd never gone to a demonstration in their life, Holocaust survivors, people turned up to demonstrate the anti-Semitism that they were seeing in the Labour Party. Nothing changed. This was over 2 years ago? Over 2 years ago now. Nothing's changed. I believe in the inherent goodness of people. I believe that if you make a mistake, you hold up your hands, you learn, and you say you're sorry. And if that had happened, everything might be okay. But it hasn't. At no point have people turned around and truly done the work to educate themselves, because it's a bunker mentality. They view everything as attacks against them and their leadership. We started a programme of training, of education. Went around the country on a lot of trains. Bear in mind, it's not a big country, it's plausible. Educating people about what contemporary anti-Semitism was, how it manifested itself in the Labour Party. And there was one incident in a town up north with a tiny Jewish community, not huge, they probably have never met Jews before. It's a student club, but there was one much older gentleman there, who I assumed was there doing a PhD. The first thing I asked this group is, how many Jews are there in the UK? How big is the Jewish community? And he goes, but are you a community? Every single thing I say, not my co-trainer who was male, just me who was female, every single thing I said, this man challenged me. Building up and up and up until Holocaust distortion. Talked about what my people were doing which was like the Nazis, what they were doing in Gaza. To which I said, oh, well, I'm not Israeli, I don't really know what you're talking about, and I'm not taking any more questions from you. The idea that there is intersection between anti-Semitism and misogyny comes in here. He didn't say a thing to my male colleague. He wanted to challenge me, the woman, the young woman, who was there trying to educate him. He thought he knew better. He'd come to a training session run by two Jews who have a very clear understanding of what modern-day anti-Semitism is, decided that he knew better, and challenged me because of what he'd read of anti-Semites on the internet. And that's really tough, and that happened across the country. Because people don't understand that when Jews speak up about anti-Semitism, it's not a personal grudge against Jeremy Corbyn. It's because we're victims of anti-Semitism in the UK in 2019, and nothing is being done by the Labour Party to make it better. We tried to do a rule change. We thought, okay, the Labour Party rule book is really quite broken, let's try fix it. We wrote a rule change, we got it signed off, that made there's an act of British law called the Equalities Act, which lists all the protected characteristics, being transgender, being LGBT, disabled, not being able to discriminate against women who are pregnant, stuff like that. Any of the protected characteristics. We tried to write into the Labour Party rule book that any protected characteristic, if you discriminate against them, that is a specific offence within the rule book. You'd think that'd be fine. Took 6 months of negotiation to get the wording right, because they wanted to add in context. Only if someone can prove, you can prove that they're anti-Semitism. I can't look into someone's heart. I know that if someone is abusive or racist towards me, that is an offence, and that is wrong, and that person should be punished for the work that they are doing.
Despite 20 years of reading about anti-Semitism, thinking about anti-Semitism, I realised I did not understand it. And I don't think I am any nearer now. So what I want to do today is weep, but you can read that on page 4. What I want to do today is think through or talk aloud what I'm thinking about anti-Semitism, why we have anti-Semitism, and then I want to move on to think whether we should actually carry on talking about anti-Semitism or whether there is something new in the world. And here I'm thinking of anti-Zionism without the hyphen, but I'll explain that in a moment. So bear with me. I don't know how long it's taking. I shouldn't think it will take too long. If it does go on, please stop me, or the gentle sound of snoring. The first thing Robert Fine, who I did my PhD with, said to me, he said, anti-Semitism, if you want to know about Jews, never ask an anti-Semite. The first thing we must remember is that anti-Semitism is never about Jews. It is about anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism tells us more about anti-Semites than it can ever tell us about Jews. Thank you. I think I'll stop. Stop while I'm here. And that's true generally. So, why do we have anti-Semitism? I'm against naturalizing the idea of anti-Semitism. I'm against the idea of saying non-Jews will always hate Jews. That is not good enough, and it's also not true. So, what I'm thinking at the moment is I've gone to Robert Fine and Phil Spencer's book, and part of their idea is that the Jewish question is itself a fake question. It's an anti-Semitic question. What is it about the Jews that we can change? What is it about the Jews that are wrong, that's wrong? What is it about the Jews that don't allow them to integrate into society? And that question only turned up at the time of Jewish emancipation. Anti-Semitism, if we're going to use it historically, is not generic Jew hatred. It's not even racist Jew hatred. As Hannah Arendt argues, the race aspect of anti-Semitism was added actually quite late. But most of the anti-Semitism that we are familiar with, the Soros and the Rothschilds, etc. and so forth, turn up at the moment of Jewish emancipation. It begins with Bruno Bauer taking a pop at Marx, Wilhelm Marr crystallizes it. But when it really turns up, when anti-Semitism really turns up, is after Jewish emancipation. After. And it's here that I turn, also in Robert's book and Phil's book, to the question of ideology. What I mean by that is, anti-Semitism, when it crystallizes in the 1870s, completely, and this is Arendt's argument, completely and utterly breaks free from anything that Jews do. It becomes an ideology. Arendt defines an ideology as an axiomatically accepted premise where everything fits into that idea, forced into that idea. It pretends to know the secret of the past, the intricacies of the present, and the uncertainties of the future. So anti-Semitism breaks with the real world. But at the same time, it captures something of the real world. I want to be careful because I am not saying in any shape, size or form that Jews or any other group are responsible for the racism or the anti-Semitism they confront. What happens is that because it's an ideology, because everything that Jews do or don't do gets forced into that initial premise, in which case, for example, Jews are evil inherently. Zionism and Israel is evil inherently. There's no a bit of this, a bit of that. Everything that Jews do fits into an ideology of the Jewish question, fits into the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with Jews. So when we look, and I think that the best thing, Arendt's section on the origins of totalitarianism, the first section, and I know people have ambivalent views about Arendt, and there's that new book, the yellow book. What was Susie Linfield has written a rather good chapter in her recent book on sort of the ambivalence of Arendt. But what Arendt, how I read that, is Arendt shows how Jews going about their business, living their lives, feeds into the myths of anti-Semitism. So, for example, she shows that in the 18th century, courts, princes, early modern states, because no one would fund them, would turn to Jewish financiers. They also quite liked the idea. They would use Jews because of international connections. They would use them as communications. Whilst European countries were at war with each other, the Jews would be used as a way to get messages through. Jews would fund peace conferences, and so on and so forth. Once those Jewish activities, real political engagement, is forced into the ideology of anti-Semitism, then we get the myths, the lies, that Jews are the Soroses control the finances of the world, that Jews care more about any other country themselves internationally, that they undermine the nation and so forth. In other words, I don't know if you got it in the States, there's a program called Game of Thrones, where it's complete fantasy because dragons don't exist. Sorry, spoiler alert. Dragons don't exist, and then they're not appearing in the prequel either. In order for anti-Semitism to work, in order for it to gain traction, generation after generation, it cannot be entire fantasy. The idea, George Soros is very pro-EU. George Soros funds NGOs that are supportive of human rights. The Rothschilds is a bank. I think they're still a bank, aren't they? Okay.
Macron worked for them, didn't he?
Who?
Macron.
Yes. And now he's president. Just saying.
Still works for them.
Still works. Now, these are, unless you had that reality, anti-Semitism won't work. But that is not to say, a very good example, and David was talking about being framed, and Ella was talking about being framed by Al Jazeera. There was a documentary a few months ago where some junior guy, you probably know the story better than me, some junior guy from the Israeli embassy was shouting his mouth off on film, saying,
It's the same one.
It's the same one.
Al Jazeera documentary.
Give me the money, and I'll make sure that every anti-Israel MP is going to suffer the fate of the
No, I didn't say
fates.
that. It was about Alan Duncan, he said. He
No.
wanted to take Alan Duncan down.
Was Alan Duncan? Okay, I'm using this as an illustration, but thank you. Now, this guy was a junior guy. Please, if I'm getting the story too wrong for the point I made, so you've got this young schnip shouting his mouth off, promising the world to somebody.
In a pub, wasn't it?
In a pub.
In a restaurant.
In a restaurant.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Jonathan! Okay.
I wrote the definitive blog about it.
Okay. I don't think it was Rubens, which is unfortunately closing.
I think definitive blog is an oxymoron.
Anyway, this guy, young guy, shoots his mouth off. It hits the press because of the documentary. The guy gets booted out the embassy, that's that. However, this young man trying to be a big boy becomes the proof that Israel runs the British government. Jeremy Corbyn the next day is so outraged, he writes to Theresa May to demand a public inquiry, echoing his call that the Zionist lobby, which he wrote a few months earlier, is running the British Home Office. The point is that how else anti-Semitism works is something, a one-off, and not even important one-off, becomes evidence and proof of a massive conspiracy. It becomes mythologized. And when one is on the internet and one is complaining about the myth of the Israel lobby, you will always get, but what about Shalit, whatever his name was? As if that proves it. However, it's not just the little things. A lot of my work has been on Holocaust memorialism and the way that the Holocaust has been taken within anti-Semitic discourse. And this is, I think, a prime example of how anti-Semitic ideology works. Even the Holocaust has been inverted so that Jews now benefit from it. The Holocaust is now our excuse for Israel. Now, the relationship between the Shoah and Israel is a very interesting history. It's a very complicated history. But now, apparently, because of the Shoah, Stalin, always the Jew lover, Churchill, always the Jew lover, said, you know, I feel so bad, give them Israel. And then, of course, the Holocaust is used to silence everyone. That's how anti-Semitic ideology works. Jews wear the Holocaust as a badge to silence everyone else. So even the most tragic moment in Jewish history, oh God, even the most tragic moment in Jewish history becomes inverted into Jewish privilege. Now I want to finish off because this bit I really am thinking aloud here. And I don't know if I'm right. There we are, an academic who actually says, I don't know if I'm right.
Doesn't mean it, though.
Of course I don't mean it. Something happened in 1948. Something different happened to Jewish history in 1948. Israel was founded. Now, if, as I said at the top of this thinking aloud exercise, that Jewish emancipation and the Jewish question is related, then the type of emancipation that Israel offered was self-determination, national self-determination. Previously, Jewish emancipation was emancipation within the nation state. So, you know, we're all English, we're all American, we're all Italian for now, and so on and so forth. Something different happened with Israel. Jewish history shifted and Jews were national emancipation. And if I'm right, and I don't know if I am, but if I'm right about trying to understand anti-Semitism in relationship, a distorted, twisted relationship with world events in which Jews are active, then it seems to me that something changed with anti-Semitism as well. Anti-Semitism shifts, and if you read the great anti-Semites of today, philosophers like Alain Badiou and others, he says, gosh, just like Wilhelm Marr did in the 1870s, it was terrible, that anti-Semitism of the past. It was awful. Thank goodness that's in the past. But what I've got to say about Israel and Zionism, this is new, and it breaks my heart to tell you that it's evil through and through and through and through, which is just like the beginning of Wilhelm Marr's.
I thought Corbyn was finished. I thought, you know, he looks ridiculous, he sounds ridiculous, he's on the ropes, until I saw Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson brings him alive, breathes air into him. Boris Johnson is going to precipitate a huge crisis in this country. He's promising to do it on Halloween, right? And there will be economic and political crisis, and crisis leads who knows where, but you can be certain that there are cadres of people on both the far right and on both the far left who are at the moment educating themselves to understand that the cosmopolitan elite and the educated and the people in the cities and finance capital are at the root of all our trouble, or that the Zionists stand between us and socialism. So I think any time I hear anyone say, well, isn't the right worse than the left? The real anti-Semitism is over there. You know, don't worry about Corbyn, because the real anti-Semitism is in Pittsburgh and in Washington, D.C. and on the far right. And then people on the far right, they say, well, don't worry about Steve Bannon. The real anti-Semitism is over there amongst the Islamists and amongst the left and the communists. That's the real threat. And any time you hear somebody point away from their own political community at somewhere else and say the real problem is over there, then you know what they're doing, and what they're doing is whitewashing the problem in their own political community. So always mistrust somebody who says, but isn't the real problem over there? The problem is bigger than anyone is saying. The problem is a crisis of democracy. The problem is a crisis on the left and a crisis on the right of people saying the same things. The quotation I gave you, and a number of these quotes from Matt, could easily, equally have been said by the Brexiters or by the Trumpists or by the Corbynites. There are so many elements of rhetoric that they have in common, and they fit so well with my 7 points of Hannah Arendt's totalitarian movement that we need to worry even more than we do. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.